The clouds hung low, casting a dull gray light over the sprawling cemetery, where rows of headstones stretched endlessly in every direction. The occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic beyond the cemetery's gates were the only sounds that punctuated the otherwise silent afternoon. Henry Clarkson stood in front of a polished granite headstone, his reflection blurred in the cool, smooth surface. The name Margaret Clarkson was etched in delicate script, along with the dates that marked her birth and death. It had been 10 years now, but the ache in Henry's chest hadn't softened with time. He was dressed in a dark suit today, a departure from his usual attire. Every year on the anniversary of her passing, he visited Margaret's grave, but today felt different. The weight of the suit pressed down on him, as though it symbolized the heavier sadness he carried. Henry, an 80-year-old man with sharp blue eyes and hair as white as the headstone before him, stared at the ground, lost in memories of a life shared with the woman he'd loved for more than 50 years. He knelt slowly, his knees aching from both age and the familiar sorrow that gripped him. Gently, he placed a single red rose at the base of the headstone. "Miss you, Maggie," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He closed his eyes, feeling the damp chill of the day settle into his bones. For a long moment, Henry remained there, immersed in the quiet, almost sacred communion with his wife. Then the sound of quiet sobbing reached his ears, faint but persistent, coming from somewhere not too far away. He straightened slowly, peering across the cemetery grounds. Not far from Margaret's grave, Henry saw a young man sitting by a headstone, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with the force of his tears. The sight tugged at something deep inside Henry. There had been a time when he too had been unable to contain his grief in such a public place. He recognized the weight of sorrow when he saw it. For a moment, Henry hesitated. It wasn't his business to interfere. But something about the young man's hunched figure, the sheer loneliness radiating from him, called to Henry. Before he could fully process his decision, his feet began moving toward the man, the gravel crunching softly under his shoes. The encounter. "Excuse me, son," Henry said gently as he approached, his voice soft but carrying the weight of years. "You all right?" The young man's head jerked up, startled by the intrusion. His eyes were red, his face streaked with tears. He looked to be in his mid-20s with dark hair that was slightly disheveled, as if he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. For a moment, he just stared at Henry, as though struggling to understand why someone had approached him. I'm fine," the young man finally replied, though his voice wavered. He quickly wiped at his face with the sleeve of his jacket, trying to compose himself. I didn't mean to disturb anyone." Henry shook his head. "No disturbance at all. I just saw you here, and I know it can't be easy." He glanced at the headstone beside the young man, noticing for the first time that it was fairly new, its polished surface still unweathered by time. The young man followed Henry's gaze and saw. "I just found him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My grandfather. I've been searching for him my whole life, and now I finally find him, and he's gone." Henry felt a sudden pang in his chest. "Your grandfather?" he asked, his voice soft with understanding. The young man nodded. "Yeah," he said, his eyes drifting back to the headstone. "I never knew him. My mom, she never talked about him, not until she was on her deathbed. That's when she told me. She said my grandfather was the man I'd been looking for my whole life, but she never wanted me to know. She didn't tell me why." Henry took a deep breath, processing the weight of the young man's words. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment. "That's a lot to carry." The young man nodded, biting his lip as he stared at the ground. "I just don't understand why she kept it from me. I spent years looking for him. I thought maybe, I don't know, maybe there was some kind of family secret, something but when she finally told me his name, I thought I'd find him alive, you know? I thought I'd have a chance to meet him." "What's your name, son?" Henry asked, his tone gentle but probing. David, the young man said, wiping his face again with the back of his hand. David Thompson. Henry nodded. I'm Henry, he said, extending his hand. David hesitated for a moment before reaching out and shaking it. Henry's grip was firm, but kind. His eyes filled with an empathy that surprised even Hy. He had come here today to mourn his own loss, to reflect on the life he'd shared with Margaret. But now, standing before this young man, he felt a strange connection, something he couldn't quite explain. David exhaled a shaky breath and glanced back at the grave. It's strange, you know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been imagining what he might be like for so long, and now I'll never know. Henry studied the young man's face, seeing the raw grief, the confusion, and the long. It was like looking into a mirror, reflecting his own pain, but also something more. There was a yearning in David's eyes that Henry recognized, an emptiness that came from not knowing, from the unfinished stories left behind by those who had passed. What do you know about him? Henry asked, curiosity nudging him forward. David shook his head slowly. Not much. I only know what my mom told me before she died. She said he was a businessman, a successful one, that he made a lot of money, but she never explained why she left, why she cut ties. She just said that he wasn't the man I thought he'd be. Henry frowned, feeling a flicker of something strange stir within him. And his name? He asked quietly, though his heart began to beat a little faster. David hesitated, looking down at the grave again, his face tightening with emotion. His name was Henry Clarkson. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He stared at David, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. The name was his own. His heart thudded in his chest as he looked down at the grave, seeing the inscription for the first time. Henry Clarkson. It couldn't be. It was impossible. His own name, staring back at him from a grave he had never seen before. David's voice broke the silence. Do you know him? Henry didn't respond right away. His eyes remained fixed on the name, the dates below it sending a chill down his spine. Slowly, he looked up at David, his voice faltering for the first time. I don't know, Henry said softly, his mind still grappling with the impossibility of what he was seeing. I don't know. The weight of regret. Henry sat on the worn bench that faced his wife's grave, the weight of David's revelation pressing down on him like a heavy stone. His thoughts swirled in confusion. How could this be? He was Henry. He was alive. But then, whose name was on that grave? And why did David think that his grandfather had been buried here? He closed his eyes, trying to calm the storm of questions in his mind, but instead, memories of Margaret flooded his senses. The image of her smiling at him from across the breakfast table, her laugh filling their home, came to him so vividly that it felt like she was sitting beside him again. They had been so young then, newly married and full of hope for the future. Margaret had wanted children. She had dreamed of filling their home with the sound of little feet and laughter. But Henry had been consumed by his work. The company had been growing, and with it his responsibilities. There had always been one more deal to close, one more client to impress. The cemetery around him slowly coming back into focus. David was still standing near the grave, his arms crossed as he stared at the inscription with a mixture of confusion and grief, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of regret. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but the words tumbled from his lips as if they had been waiting years to escape. David turned to look at him, surprised by the sudden confession. I was too busy, always working, always chasing something. By the time I realized what I was missing, it was too late. David's eyes softened, and for the first time, Henry saw something shift in the young man's expression, a flicker of understanding. My mom, Rachel, David began, his voice thick with emotion. She was always distant. There was this sadness about her that I never understood. She didn't talk much about her past, but every once in a while I'd catch her staring off into space like she was remembering something painful. I think she was hiding something from me. Henry nodded. sensing the weight of the unspoken words between them. Parents often think they're protecting us by keeping things hidden, but sometimes those secrets cause more harm than good. David looked down, his brow furrowed. She never told me about my grandfather until she was dying. I always thought it was strange that she never mentioned him when I was growing up. She raised me on her own and we didn't have much, but I never questioned it. I guess I didn't want to push her. Henry glanced at the young man, seeing the hurt etched into his features. He knew that kind of pain, the ache of not knowing, of wondering why things had been kept from you. Henry had spent his life chasing success, and in the process, he had lost something far more precious. Bonds of the heart. The silence between them stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was an understanding growing between the two, something unspoken but deeply felt. Henry saw a reflection of his own younger self in David, the same loneliness, the same longing for connection. "Tell me about your mother," Henry said after a long pause, his curiosity piqued by David's story. David let out a shaky breath, as if he had been holding it in for too long. "She was a good woman, strong. She had to be, raising me on her own. But she was always sad. I didn't understand it when I was a kid. But now that I'm older, I think she was carrying a lot of pain." Henry nodded, his heart heavy with sympathy. He thought of Margaret again, of the dreams she had carried silently, dreams that he had been too blind to see until it was too late. David continued, "I used to ask her about my father, but she never gave me a straight answer. It was like he didn't exist, and as for her family, I didn't even know she had any until she was on her deathbed. That's when she told me about my grandfather." Henry listened closely, feeling a strange sense of connection with David's story. He knew all too well the cost of secrets, the burden they placed on those left behind. "She said his name was Henry Clarkson," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She told me that he was successful, wealthy, but that something had happened between them. Something she couldn't. I wanted to ask more, but she was so weak by then. I didn't want to push her." Henry swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotions he hadn't expected. This young man standing before him was searching for something, answers, closure, perhaps even a connection he had never known. Henry felt an inexplicable urge to help him, to guide him, though he wasn't entirely sure why. "I don't know what to tell you," Henry said after a long moment. "But I feel like maybe we were meant to meet today. Maybe there's something more to this." David looked at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Do you really think so?" Henry nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what he believed. But there was something undeniable between them, a bond that felt as though it had been forged in the quiet spaces between their grief and regret. "I do," Henry said softly. "I think we were both looking for something when we came here today. Maybe we can help each other find it." David's eyes welled up with tears again, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow. There was something else in his expression now, something lighter, a sense of relief that he hadn't felt in a long time. Henry stood slowly, his joints creaking with the effort. "Why don't we walk for a bit?" he suggested, nodding toward the cemetery path. "We can talk more, maybe figure out what this all means." David nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Yeah," he said, his voice steadier now. As they began to walk side by side, Henry felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just the strange connection between them that stirred him. It was the way David looked at him, with a mixture of respect and hope. It had been years since Henry had felt that kind of bond with anyone, and now with each step it grew stronger. David was, in a way, the son Henry had never had, and though neither of them fully understood it yet, a new chapter was beginning in both their lives, one that would reshape the future they had never expected to find. The shocking discovery. As Henry and David continued to walk through the cemetery, the conversation gradually faded into a contemplative silence. They had shared more in the past hour than either of them had in years, but now, Something was pulling Henry back toward the grave. He needed to see it again, to look more closely. There was something about it that felt wrong. He hadn't fully registered it before, but there was an unsettled feeling gnawing at the edges of his mind. The name, the dates, even the polished stone. It all seemed too familiar, too close to home. And then, there was the strange coincidence of his own name being on the headstone. David. "I need to go back to the grave," Henry said, his voice laced with an urgency he couldn't quite explain. "There's something I didn't look closely at, something that's been bothering me." David hesitated but nodded, sensing the seriousness in Henry's tone. They made their way back toward the grave, the quiet rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant hum of the city beyond the cemetery walls, the only sounds that accompanied them. When they reached the grave, Henry approached slowly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the details. The headstone was pristine, newer than the others surrounding it, yet something about it felt wrong. His eyes finally settled on the photo. A small, oval-shaped picture had been affixed just above the name. Henry's breath caught in his throat. The photo was of him, not a younger version of him, not someone who bore a striking resemblance. Him. The familiar lines of his face, the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, even the slight tilt of his mouth, all staring back at him from the grave of another man. He staggered back a step, his heart pounding in his chest. What the hell is this?" he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. David, noticing Henry's sudden change, stepped forward. "What's wrong?" he asked, his brow furrowing with concern. Henry pointed at the photo, his hand trembling. "Look at it. Look at the picture." David leaned in, squinting as he studied the image. For a moment he didn't understand, but then his eyes widened in shock. That's you." Henry nodded, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. How was this possible? Why was his photo on this grave? He felt a surge of anger rise up, confusion clouding his judgment. "Is this some kind of prank?" he snapped, turning to face David, his voice sharp. "Did you do this?" David's eyes widened in surprise. "What? No. I don't know anything about this. I swear." Henry's hands shook as he clenched his fists, his mind swirling with doubt. "This is my face, David. My face on a grave with my name. How could that happen by coincidence?" David shook his head frantically, his confusion mirroring Henry's. I don't even know what's going on here. I just came here because my mom told me to find my grandfather. I didn't know about any of this." Henry took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He could see the genuine confusion and fear in David's eyes, and he knew the young man wasn't lying. But that didn't make this any less terrifying. His photo on a tombstone, his name, his face. What did this mean? They both stood there in stunned silence for a long moment, neither of them knowing what to say. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees above them as if the very air around them was unsettled by this revelation. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice quieter now. "We need to figure this out. There's got to be an explanation." David nodded slowly, still shaken. "But where do we even start?" Henry stared at the headstone, his mind flashing back to fragments of memories, some clear, some buried under years of forgetfulness. And then, like a bolt of lightning, a memory came rushing back, another face nearly identical to his own. "Thomas," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. David looked at him in confusion. "What?" "Thomas," Henry repeated, louder this time. "My brother." "You have a brother?" David asked, surprised. Henry nodded slowly, still trying to piece together the fragments of his past. "I had a brother. A twin, actually. His name was Thomas. But we lost touch. It was so long ago. We were close when we were young, but something happened. Something I can't quite. He disappeared. I haven't seen or heard from him in decades." David's eyes widened. "Wait, Are you saying this grave might belong to your brother? Henry rubbed his temples, his mind racing. It's possible. I don't know. But the dates, they don't make sense. This grave is newer than it should be if it's for Thomas. I would have heard something. Someone would have contacted me. Maybe he changed his identity, David suggested, his voice cautious. Maybe that's why you didn't know. Henry frowned, considering the possibility. Maybe. But why use my photo? David shook his head, still perplexed. I don't know. Maybe someone else put it there. Someone who didn't know about your brother but knew you. If they saw an old picture of him, maybe they thought it was you. Henry's mind was spinning, but there was a strange kind of sense in David's theory. He needed answers. We have to look into this, Henry said firmly. We have to find out who buried this man and why they used my pee. David nodded, a determined look crossing his face. Yeah, let's figure this out. Together. Uncovering the past. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, internet searches, and visits to local records offices. Henry and David dug through everything they could find about the grave, the name on the headstone, and any connection to Thomas Clarkson. The more they uncovered, the more questions arose. But slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. One morning, as they sat at Henry's dining room table, surrounded by papers and notes, David's phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at it, and his eyes widened. I found something. Henry looked up, his heart skipping a beat. What is it? David tapped on his phone, pulling up a grainy photograph. This is from an old obituary I found in the archives. It's from about 20 years ago. Look at this. Henry leaned over to look at the screen. The photograph was black and white, but there was no mistaking the man in the picture. It was his brother Thomas, staring back at him, looking almost exactly as Henry remembered him from their younger years. It's him, Henry whispered, his throat tight with emotion. David nodded. Yeah, and look at the name. He changed it. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He was using a different name. No one would have known. David continued. It says here that he died alone without any close family. He was estranged from everyone, but there's something strange. The man who organized the burial wasn't a family member. It was an old business acquaintance. Someone who apparently didn't know about your brother's true identity. Henry's heart sank as he read the obituary again, his mind trying to grasp the enormity of it all. His brother, his twin, had lived the last years of his life under a different name, away from everyone who knew him. And in a final twist of fate, this acquaintance had used the wrong photo on the grave, mistaking Henry's picture for Thomas's. So he died alone, Henry said softly, a wave of sadness washing over him. And no one even knew who he really was. David placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. But we know now. And maybe we can make sure he's remembered the right way. Henry nodded, his eyes misting over as he stared at the obituary. I owe him that much. The cost of distance, the truth had settled over Henry like a thick, suffocating fog. His twin brother Thomas had lived and died alone, estranged from the world, bearing a name that wasn't his own. The eerie coincidence of his face on Thomas's grave was no longer a mystery. It was the byproduct of years of distance, secrets, and silence. But as the fog lifted, a deeper truth came into focus, one that cut deeper than anything else. Rachel. Henry hadn't thought of her much in recent years, not because he didn't care, but because it was easier not to. She had left his life so long ago, taking her secrets with her. But now, with David sitting across the table from him, it was impossible to avoid the realization that Rachel had been a casualty of his own choices, just like Thomas. She had carried the weight of his distance, his coldness all those years. His obsessive focus on success and wealth had pushed her away, just as it had isolated him from everyone else. David, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions swirling through Henry, looked up from the document spread across the table. You said you and Thomas were close when you were young. What happened between you two? Henry took a deep breath, staring at the stack of papers without really seeing them. Memories flickered in his mind like old photographs. We were inseparable once, but as we got older, things changed. I got caught up in building my business, making a name for myself. Thomas, he wasn't like me. He didn't care about money or success. He wanted something else. We argued, drifted apart, and then one day he just disappeared. I never heard from him again. David leaned forward, his voice quiet. Do you think Rachel leaving had something to do with that? With you being distant? The question hit Henry like a punch to the gut. He hadn't wanted to face it, but now, looking at David, he couldn't deny it any longer. I think she did. Rachel and I, our relationship wasn't warm. I didn't know how to be there for her. I was always too busy. I thought providing financially was enough, but I realize now that it wasn't. I wasn't there for her emotionally. I didn't give her the attention she needed. David's face softened, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. She always seemed, I didn't know why, but now, I guess that makes sense. Henry felt the familiar weight of regret settle over him, but this time, it felt heavier. He had failed his daughter, just as he had failed his brother. And now, sitting here with David, he realized the full extent of that failure. His daughter had hidden her son from him, kept David away from the family connection he had longed for, all because Henry hadn't been the father she needed. I failed her, Henry said, his voice thick with emotion, and because of that I failed you. David stared at him, the silence between them heavy with unspoken pain. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then finally, David spoke, his voice quiet but steady. You didn't know, he said. You didn't know what she was going through, and she didn't give you a chance to fix things. Henry shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. That's no excuse. I should have tried harder. I should have reached out. I should have been there for her. And now, David looked down at his hands, his expression torn. I spent my whole life wondering about my family. I always thought there was something wrong with me, something I did that made her keep everything a secret. But now, I see that it was more complicated than that. Henry wiped his eyes, his voice shaking. I'm sorry, David. I'm sorry for everything. For not being there for Rachel, for not knowing about you, for the way my choices hurt the people I loved. I can't change the past, but I want to make things right now if you'll let me. David was silent for a moment, his eyes searching Henry's face. Then, slowly, he nodded. I don't blame you for what happened. I get it now. How people can hurt each other without meaning to. And I think my mom would have wanted us to find each other. She didn't want to live in the past. Neither should we. Henry's breath caught in his throat. The weight of decades of guilt and regret lifted, just a little. He reached out, placing his hand on David's, and for the first time he felt a real connection. Not just with David, but with the family he had lost so long ago. I never got to be a father to Rachel, Henry said, his voice barely a whisper. But maybe I can be a grandfather to you. David smiled, tears brimming in his eyes. I'd like that. I think I've been waiting for that my whole life, rebuilding what was lost. The following weeks were a blur of healing conversations, shared memories, and tentative steps toward building a new relationship. Henry and David spent hours piecing together the fragmented history of their family, but more importantly, they spent time learning about each other, about the man Henry had become in his later years, and the man David was growing into. There were still moments of sadness, of regret for the years lost, and the relationships that could never be but there was also hope, a quiet, steady hope that they could make the most of the time they had left. One afternoon, as they sat together in Henry's garden, sipping lemonade and watching the sun set over the trees, David looked at Henry and smiled. You know, I used to think that finding my grandfather would be like filling in the last piece of a puzzle, David said. But now I realize, it's not about finding answers. It's about building something new. Henry nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. You're right, it's not about what we lost, it's about what we have now. David looked at him, a serious expression crossing his face. You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever have. A sense of family. A place I belong. Henry felt tears prick the corners of his eyes, but this time, they were tears of joy. And you've given me a second chance, David. A chance to be the kind of family I should have been all along. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the garden, Henry realized that his life, once filled with the hollow pursuit of success and wealth, now had something far more valuable. Family. He had found redemption, not in his fortune, but in the love and connection he had found with his grandson. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was theirs to build. And for the first time in years, Henry felt at peace. Thank you for sticking with me through this heartwarming journey. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment. I love reading your thoughts and they inspire me to keep creating content like this.